Yirmiyahu was a prophet, was a good chaver of mine. Never understood a single word he said, but we helped him to drink his yain. And we always have some mighty fine yain. Singing Simchat Le'olam, Kol HaYiladim now. Simcha to the dagim in the deep blue sea. Simcha to you and me.
Welcome to the Haftarah Plethora video podcast, where we bring a little joy to the world by talking about the prophets and their writings. And today, we're going to talk about one of the greats, if not the greatest of them all, despite not having his own book. The prophet that we all know and love, the prophet on whose chair we sit just 8 days after coming into the world, the prophet who sips our wine at every Passover Seder, the prophet with whom we sing, or to whom we sing, at the conclusion of every Shabbat. And the prophet...
We get it. We're going to talk about Elijah. Does that mean that the Messiah is coming?
Perhaps, especially since we're almost finished with all the possible Haftorot. This Haftorah is the 83rd of the full cycle of 85 Haftorot that we've discussed, and the very last non-holiday Haftorah associated with a specific parsha. Today we have the rarely read Haftarah for Pinhas, which comes from the first book of Kings, and it's all about our Messiah announcing prophet, the great and wonderful Eliyahu, Elijah. But first, I'm Larry Herman, drinking some very fine wine and talking Haftarah with my very good chaver, Rick Muller, the king of cannellation. How you doing today, Rick?
I'm wondering about the rarely read part. What gives?
Rick, surely you know, and most of our viewers will probably know, that the Haftarah that we read in shul this Shabbat is not from the first book of Kings and is not about Elijah, because it's the first Shabbat following the 17th of Tammuz and the start of the 3 weeks. Instead, we'll read the first Haftarah of admonition from Jeremiah,
which, if I'm not mistaken, was one of the first Haftorahs we covered during the early months of the pandemic 3 years ago.
Good memory, Rick. Not only that year, but we continued to read the Haftarah from Jeremiah in 2021, 2022, and we will continue to do so for 11 more years. The next time we actually read the Haftarah about Elijah from chapter 19 of 1 Kings will be in the Jewish year 5795, corresponding to 2035.
Wow, so we really are ahead of schedule. 12 years.
Like my father used to say, plan ahead. Except when he would say, let's cross that bridge when we come to it. I could never figure out which was which.
Okay, well, this is one heck of a long bridge if we're talking about a Haftarah that we won't actually read in public for 12 more years. But I know that this is not the only Haftarah about Elijah.
That's true, Rick. The Haftarah for Ki Tisa, which we discussed last year, included the most famous of the Elijah stories, his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. That Haftarah concluded with the people proclaiming, Adonai hu ha'Elohim, Adonai is God.
And the rabbis liked that phrase so much that they had us saying it 7 times at the conclusion of the Yom Kippur Ne'ilah service every year.
The Haftarah for Pinhas picks up that story, describing Elijah's fleeing from Queen Jezebel, who wants to kill him in revenge for Elijah's slaughter of the prophets of Baal. And here's an interesting tidbit. The actual description of the slaughter of the prophets of Baal is told in the 6 verses that we do not read, which are in between the ending of the Haftarah for Ki Tisa and the start of the Haftarah for Pinhas.
I wonder why the sages decided not to include that as part of the Haftarah cycle. Too violent?
Well, that would be a change, since the sages never seem to shy away from violence elsewhere. Samuel's execution of Agag comes to mind. Anyway, our Haftarah continues with the story of Elijah encountering God, reminding us of how God revealed himself to Moses in Ki Tisa. It kind of makes me wonder why this isn't the Haftarah for Ki Tisa.
Yeah, And then the story of the slaughter of the prophets of Baal could have been the Haftarah for Pinhas, which also includes God commanding Moses to defeat the Midianite Baal worshippers.
Good point, Rick. Are you volunteering for the job of rearranging all of the Haftorot?
No, not me.
The Eitz Chaim Chumash tells us that the connection between the Torah and Haftarah portions for Pinhas is the zeal against false worship shared by Pinhas and Elijah. Anyway, I know that the meeting between God and Elijah is something that you're going to want to talk about.
Indeed I do, sir. The tropes tell us that the communication between God and Elijah is the most important piece of the whole story.
Agreed. And we'll get to that in a minute. Anyways, in the Haftarah, God eventually gets around to giving Elijah 3 assignments. First, to anoint Hazael as the king of Aram. Second, to anoint Yehu as the king of Israel. And third, to anoint Elisha to succeed him as prophet. But only the last of these is actually described in our Haftarah.
That's a lot of anointing. But how about if you anoint me to start talking about the trope?
Excellent idea, Rick, especially since I know that this Haftarah is chock full of rare and special trope. What have you got for us?
Well, by now I hope that you and our viewers know that one of my ideas is that the rarest trope were placed on the words and phrases that our sages thought needed to be emphasized.
Because they accentuated all the drama and action described in the Haftarah, right?
Yeah, well, maybe not all the drama and action, but that's the general idea. The Masoretes, particularly the Ben Asher family of scribes and scholars, transmitted the oral tradition they received, the Masorah, in the early part of the 10th century. So Aaron ben Moses ben Asher, that was the family, he placed vocalization and accentuation symbols, in other words, the vowels and the trope, on Solomon ben Buya's biblical manuscript in a book that they called the Keter, or the Crown, in which today what's left of it is known as the Aleppo Codex, and it's in the Israel Museum. And our text and the tropes and pronunciations that I chant all go way back to their work.
That's a long tradition to follow. But Rick, I know that you have lots of original ideas and interpretations of what the trope are telling us.
Well, thanks. I try. I just hope that it makes the chanting a little more interesting.
You know that it does, Rick. I suggested today we go back to our old plan of attack. Let's divide the Haftarah into 3 parts. You can guide us through the trope and the other interpretations of the text for each section before you chant.
Sounds good to me.
So let's divide the discussion and the chanting as follows. We'll start with the final verse of chapter 18 and continue with the first 7 verses of chapter 19, which describe Jezebel's threat to kill Elijah and his escape to the Judean desert. Then we'll continue with Elijah's encounter with God at Horeb, or Mount Sinai, in verses 8 through 14. And we'll conclude with God's anointing instructions and Elijah's encounter with Elisha in verses 15 through 21.
I can work with that. So let's start with the most obvious of the rare and special trope that appears 4 times in the first part, which tells the story of Eliyahu's separation, flight, hiding, and moving. We have a Zakef Gadol in verses 3, 4, and 6. All of them are on verbs and all make a link between Elijah and other biblical characters. In verse 3, we have Vayavo, and he came to Beersheba. This calls to mind Abraham, even though this exact wording doesn't appear in the Genesis story of Abraham. Then in verse 4, we have a very rare doubling of the Zakef Gadol, Vayavo, Vayeshev. And he came and he sat under a broom tree and prayed to die. Who can't think of Jonah sitting beneath the gourd tree, also wishing to die outside of Nineveh? Finally, verse 6 opens with Vayapet, and he looked about, and behold, there was bread and water, just as the angel of God opened Hagar's eyes to see the well of water for her and Ishmael.
Rick, I have a couple of non-trope observations on this section. First, it starts off with Elijah fleeing for his life out of fear for Jezebel. But here was the man who had fearlessly confronted the hundreds of pagan prophets, not to mention King Ahab, in the previous story. Why did he fear Jezebel?
Maybe she was more fearsome than Ahab and the pagan prophets.
And then, after fleeing for his life, we're told in verse 4 that he prays for death, begging God to take his life.
Like Moses and Jonah, he worried that the task was too much for him. But it's interesting that God assuages Elijah's desperation by sending an angel in verses 5 and 7, each time nourishing him with food and drink. God doesn't try to persuade Elijah with words.
Perhaps teaching us a lesson about how to confront those in distress. Don't try to convince them with words, but rather attend to their physical needs first.
I like that. Time to chant?
Okay.
The Haftarah can be found in your Eitz Chaim Chumash on page 938, or just follow along on the screen with Norm's beautiful text. I'll be reading through verse 7 right after the bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kichanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
V'yad Adonai hayta el Eliyahu vayeshanes motnav vayarotz lifnei Achav ad boacha Yizraela vayagid Achav le'izevel et kol asher asa Eliyahu ve'et kol asher harag ekol hanvi'im becharev vatishlach Izevel malach el Eliyahu lemor ko ya'asun Elohim v'cho yosifun ki cha'et machar asim et nafshecha kenefesh achad mehem vayar vayakom vayelech el nafsho vayavo be'er sheva asher lihuda vayanach et na'aro sham vehu halach bamidbar derech yom vayavo vayeshev tachat rotem echad vayishal et nafsho lamut vayomer rav ata Adonai kach nafshi ki lo tov anochi me'avotai vayishkav vayishan tachat rotem echad v'hine ze malach nogea bo vayomer lo kum echol vayabet v'hine mera'ashotav ugat ritzafim v'tzapachat mayim vayochal vayesht vayashov vayishkav vayashov malach Adonai shenit vayigabo vayomer kum echol ki rav mimcha hadarech.
Nicely done, Rick. And now we come to the section that I know you wanted most to talk about, Elijah's encounter with Adonai.
I do. But first I want to point out some interesting things. In verse 8, we have an Azla Geresh on the word Vayelech, and he walked with strength for 40 days and 40 nights. course, the 40 days and nights is another way of saying a long time, but the verb lalechet, the infinitive lalechet, which appears 9 times in this Haftorah, is always evocative, memory jogging, another reminder of Abraham, to whom God said, Lech lecha, while the 40 days and nights maybe reminds us of Moses on Mount Sinai.
Interesting.
Then in verse 9, and repeated in verse 13, we have the phrase, Ma lecha fo Eliyahu. What are you doing here, Eliyahu? The question itself doesn't have particularly special trope, just a mercha, tipcha, silu, but it's introduced by something special both times. In verse 9, we have Vayomer lo in front of it. The standalone munach zakif katon combination that I've theorized indicates something of importance. And in verse 13, the introduction is Vayomer, another zakif gadol. It reminds me of Adam in the garden. Ayeka, God asks, where are you? God playing hide and seek with his boy there. Literally, what's it to you, Eliyahu? Why are you here? Why are we here? To hide in a cave or be out in the world?
So you think that God is challenging Elijah to be all that he can be?
Something like that. And how does Elijah respond? In both cases, he says the exact same 25 words, which doesn't ever happen with the exact same trope. Here's the beginning of that. Vayomer kano kineti ladonai Elohei tzvaot. Notice the dramatic kadma v'azla on the phrase kano kineti, translated as I have been very zealous for Adonai. But the phrase is a repetition of the word, the verb for zealous, once as an adverb and once as a verb. It's as though Elijah is saying, I've been zealously zealous. So in answer to God's question, what are you doing here, Elijah? Elijah's answering, I'm here for you, God, commander of all the hosts of heaven, but I'm the only one left. I'm all you've got. Instruct me what to do.
I get it. But twice, the same answer? It's a moving speech, but even Robert Alter thinks that it could be a duplication in the scribal transmission.
Okay, he can think that if he wants. But the alternative is that the answer frames Elijah's encounter with God. My favorite part, verses 11 and 12. How does God speak to Elijah? First, he calls him to come out of his cave and stand on the mountain in front of God, and behold, say ve'amata v'har lifnei Adonai ve'hinei Adonai over. The munach zarka, the munach segol, the combination, followed by the dramatic darga on vehine, behold, followed by the directionality of the munach ravia coming down from the sky, Adonai over. God comes down to Elijah's level. Elijah's told to stand on the mountain just like Abraham stood on Mount Moriah and Moses stood on Mount Sinai to see the power of God.
But not to see God.
Exactly. First, Elijah beholds the Ruach Gedolah, the Chazak, Mefarek, Harim, Shabes Laim, and then the rest. Great and strong wind, tearing apart mountains and smashing rocks. Notice the rare pazer on Gedolah and the Gershayim on Vechazak. Was that God? No. Lo varuach Adonai. After the wind, Elijah experiences Ra'ash, an earthquake. Was that God? No. Lo vara'ash Adonai. And after the earthquake, Elijah witnesses Aish, fire. Was that God? No. Lo va'esh Adonai. And fire is a really big deal because pagans worship fire all the time. They danced around it. But finally, after the fire, kol dimama daka, a soft murmuring sound, a simple soft tipcha, followed by a mercha siluk, or sof pasuk, which I chant softly, just above a whisper, daka.
And that's God.
Yes, that's God as he speaks to us, not in the fire that Elijah conjured on Mount Carmel, not in the wind or the earthquake, not even in the thunderous blast of the shofar, but as recited in the Unatana Tokev prayer on the high holidays, only when kol demama daka yishama, when the still small voice is heard. We have to do our part by listening for that voice.
Rick, let's listen to you recite verses 18 through 14, 8 through 14.
Vayakom, vayochal, vayishte, vayelech, bechoach, ha'achila, hahi, arba'im yom, ve'arba'im laila, ad har ha'elohim chorev. Vayavo sham el ha'ma'ara, vayalen sham, vehine dvar Adonai elav, vayomer lo, malchafo Eliyahu, vayomer kano kineti, ladonai Elohei tzvaot, ki azvu v'ritcha b'nei Yisrael, et mizbechotecha harasu, ve'et neviecha hargu v'charev, va'ivater ani levadi, vayivakshu et nafshi lekachtach, vayomer tse ve'amata vahar lifnei Adonai, vehine Adonai over ve'ruach gidolah ve'chazak mefarek harim umshaber slaim lifnei Adonai lo varuach Adonai ve'achar haruach ra'ash lo vara'ash Adonai ve'achar hara'ash esh lo va'esh Adonai ve'achar ha'esh kol demama daka, vayehi kishmoa Eliyahu, vayalet panav be'adarto, vayetze vayamod petach hamara, vehine elav kol, vayomer malchafo Eliyahu, vayomer kano kineti, ladonai Elohei tzvaot, ki azvu v'ridcha b'nei Yisrael, et mizbechotecha harasu, ve'et neviecha hargu v'charev, va'ivater ani levadi, vayivakshu et nafshi lekachtach.
Kind of takes one's breath away.
I don't have much more to say about the ending. In verse 15, God commands Elijah again with the verb lech, with a tavir, lech, suggesting that Elijah descends the mountain and then goes up toward Damascus. And in verse 21, when Elisha rises and follows Elijah, we have yet another Vayelech with a tzivir.
I noticed that in God's command to anoint Hazael, Yehu, and Elisha, the verb is timshach, which we recognize as being connected to Moshiach or Messiah. And I was going to make a big deal of Elisha's response to Elijah's invitation to become his disciple and successor, but a still small voice tells me that it's time for you to chant the final verses.
I hear it.
Vayomer Adonai elav lech shuv ledarkecha midbara damasek uvata umashachta et Hazael lemelech al Aram ve'et Yehu ben Nimshi timshach lemelech al Yisrael ve'et Elisha ben Shaphat me'avel mechola timshach lenavi tachtecha ve'haya hanimlat mecherev Hazael Yamit Yehu V'hanimlat Mecherev Yehu Yamit Elisha V'hisharti v'Yisrael Shivat alafim Kol habirkayim Asher lo char'u LaBaal v'chol hapeh asher lo nashak lo vayelech misham vayimtza et Elisha ben Shaphat v'hu choresh 12 tzmadim lefanav v'hu Bishneim he'asar vayavor Eliyahu elav vayashlech adarto elav vayazov et habakar vayarotz acharei Eliyahu vayomer eshkana Leavi ul'imi ve'elcha acharecha vayomer lo lech shuv ki me'asiti lach vayashov me'acharav vayikach et semed habakar Vayizbachehu uvichli habakar bishlam habasar vayiten la'am vayochelu vayakom vayelech acharei Eliyahu vayishartehu.
Rick, such an interesting Haftarah. I'm kind of sorry that it's read so infrequently.
Yeah, but at least our fans out there can watch this episode every year if they want to.
Yes, they can, as they can watch all the other 82 episodes that we've recorded. Just 2 more to go, one for the second day of Sukkot and one for Simchat Torah. As always, thanks to Norm Gar for all the beautiful graphics, text, and editing. Don't forget to write us with your thoughts and comments, even though it is too late to tell us to stop. Our emails are below. And if you like our Zoomcast, please forward the link to your friends and family. We'll be seeing you after the Chagim. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.